Prospect House Media.
And now, prepare yourself for the only weekly podcast you won't want to miss. Welcome to the Ameritocracy Show with Troy Edgar, live from our studios in Los Angeles and Washington, D.C.
Hey everybody, I am Troy Edgar and welcome to the Ameritocracy Show. Thank you for tuning in and checking it out. It is greatly appreciated. This podcast examines the conditions for personal and professional growth and opportunity across America. This week, Ameritocracy is in Washington, D.C., where I'm joined by Holly Mehringer, Assistant Administrator and Chief Financial Officer for the Transportation Security Administration. Holly shares her incredible journey from Massillon, Ohio, and her 18-year civil service career in the Air Force. We talk about her transition to the Department of Homeland Security and her current role as the CFO for TSA, managing the agency's $11 billion budget. Holly discusses the challenges and the rewards of her role, and the importance of effective communication and collaboration with key stakeholders, including OMB and Congress. Her passion for her work, leadership, and commitment to public service is inspiring and has made her an effective federal leader. I hope you enjoy. Good afternoon, Holly. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Troy. How are you?
Oh my God, it's so awesome to see you.
You too. It has been a hot minute.
Yeah, it has. You know, the last time you and I got together, you were, well, we had talked a few times, but still budgets at DHS before you went over to TSA. How's it feel being over there?
I feel less schizophrenic. I feel as the budget director for DHS, every time my phone would ring, it was something different. It was the wall with CBP. It was a hurricane with FEMA. Yeah. You know, CISA, our cyber folks would call, and I still don't know what they were calling me about. But now when I'm at TSA, it's just transportation security. Yeah. My only issue is it aviation, is it rail, is it pipeline, but it's a pretty focused mission. So I feel a little less schizophrenic.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Holly, you know what? I'm going to start this interview different than I've done any of the 70 before. You brought me in a gift, so I'm just going to grab this.
I did.
It's a little story of limoncello. Yeah, so you and I, when we were at DHS together in the perils of the pandemic and things happening, I remember as a gift to me, you gave me your homebrew. Let's talk about the homebrew before, because I think we're going to have to start this the right way.
That sounds good. So my homebrew, I was stationed, and we'll talk about this in a second, but I was lucky enough with the Air Force to be stationed at Aviation Air Base in Italy, and I fell in love with limoncello. A lot of people drink that, after dinner, and I fell in love with it, and I could never find anything strong enough in the States. So since about 2007, I've been making it. Yeah. And now my wife and I, we make it for Christmas gifts, or just during the pandemic, it was an anytime gift. Yeah. So you always got to get one from that perspective. So I would be remiss if I didn't bring you one for my interview.
Thank you. And a new label.
It is a new label. Yeah, yes.
I didn't. I just realized as well. Holly, here's to you and I, and here's to seeing you again, my friend. Cheers.
Chin chin.
Chin chin.
All right.
Ooh.
That'll get us going.
I'm ready to rock and roll now. Well, we couldn't always sort the DHS budgets that way, but we should have.
I always finished them that way, though, so it's okay. It was just after hours.
So what I wanted to do a little bit was I want to talk about your career.
Yeah.
I want to talk about the path. I also want to talk about your job as CFO for TSA. Something that I'd like to do is I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the budgets to be able to kind of go through and I know that was your previous job, but as part of one of the objectives, with the continuing resolution that looks like it's going through and trying to get ready, people that don't fully understand federal budgeting on the inside might be an interesting discussion. And then lastly, I want to talk about leadership and, and your path and the way that some of the stuff that you and I have talked about before and mentoring and leadership. So if you wouldn't mind just a little bit, talk about your background and your move into federal service from the very beginning.
Oh, wow. So federal service, that was not my plan. I went to school, I went to college to major in mathematics. I wanted to be a high school math teacher. As I did that, I then realized I didn't want to be a high school math teacher because calculus is the highest you can teach at high school. And I really like higher level math. I'm a nerd. My pocket protector is on the inside of my coat. You just can't see it. I keep it hidden. So then I realized I needed a master's degree to go teach at the collegiate level. However, I was eyeball deep in debt. Luckily, my parents helped me out with some of my schooling, and I got my loans through them. But I couldn't afford to go to get my master's degree by myself. So I quickly, at the beginning of my senior year, figured out who could I work for that would like to pay for my master's degree. In the Air Force, as a civil servant, was one of those places. And it also got me out of the state of Ohio, which was the second highest priority thing I wanted in a job. I had grown up in northern Ohio, went to school in southern Ohio, so I kind of wanted to see what else was out there in life. So I interviewed with the Air Force. They have a program, it's called the Palace Acquire Intern Program. So that's where I would come in. They have it across many career fields, but I came in budgeting. So I was a budget analyst at a base. I started at Charleston Air Force Base in South Carolina. But you came in and you were a GS-7, so you were an entry level. And then a year later, you were promoted. As long as you were doing your job, you were promoted to a GS-9. And a year after that, if you continued to do well, you were a GS-11. One nice thing about that intern program is 6 months into the program, they started paying for your master's degree.
Oh, wow.
And it was kind of every credit hour they paid for, you just had to give them a very limited repayment. And it could be while you were taking your next class. So what I did is I got accepted into the College of Charleston, and I got my master's degree from them. And when did I get that? That would have been in 2005. It took me a little while because I could only take one class at a time. But at that point in time, I got the opportunity, and I was living in Italy, and I was loving being an Air Force civilian. It was a way to serve, but not in uniform. At the time, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was in place. Not that I wanted to join the military, but that would have been a limiting factor.
Yep.
But my business suit was the uniform I wore, and I served. And at that point in time, I got my master's degree, and I looked at myself in the mirror, and I said, I'm going to fail at my first professional career goal, because I've never been a college math professor. I chose at that point in time at my 5-year point that I wanted to make a career out of the federal civil service. And I've been doing that for over 24 years now. So I was in Italy, luckily, for 5 years. Dang it, I had career aspirations because I would still be a GS-11 living in Italy right now if I didn't. But I got to come back. I was at the Pentagon with the Air Force doing about a third of their operation and maintenance budget. So any dollars that it took to operate and fly the airplanes, I was a budget analyst to do that. And I would write the budget, help defend the budget to Congress. So that's where I kind of got my first. I wet my toes a little bit talking to Congress and getting yelled at by them. I had several different jobs within the Pentagon, and then I got to go over to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware as a career broadening position. So I was the Deputy Mission Support Group Commander. I think it took about 2 months before I got a budget briefing, so budget was not even in my purview. It didn't even belong in the chain of command, but it was a great 23 months to learn what the civil engineers do in the security forces. It did have the solemn mission of bringing back our fallen soldiers, so that was a no-fail, zero-error mission that a lot of our folks within the chain of command dealt with. So I was there for about 2 years. Air Force said I needed another master's degree, and I said I got one already in math. And they said, no, you need one in resource strategy. So I got to go to school for 10 months. I was a student again. I learned how to write papers, and then I came back to the Pentagon, and for lack of a better term, I was kind of the CFO equivalent for the headquarters Air Force budget, but I didn't have any accounting function, so it was kind of a CFO light. Yeah. It was still the stuff I liked, budgeting, programming, and then that got me to about 18 and a half years, and then that's when I came to DHS.
Wow.
Yeah.
So what got you to the point where you're thinking, hey, I'm going to try DHS? Because that's definitely a step out of the DoD.
It was, and I would say it was twofold. So in that job, that CFO light job that I had, it was 2 GS-15. So and it was directors of resources. So people resources and dollar resources. That's where I met my wife, Heather, or my soon-to-be wife, Heather. Yeah. We did not work for each other, so there was no conflict of interest. But knowing where I wanted, knowing we shouldn't be married and working next to each other, I started looking for new jobs. I thought I would retire from the Air Force after a long career. But at that point in time, the Air Force, for looking at senior executives in the critical positions of budgeting and programming, they put very high regard to retired military.
Wow.
And I could never have that in my resume. And I could never compete because that's not the path that I chose. So what I did is I started looking outside of, DOD, and luckily Chip Fulgham and Alan Bloom were both at DHS. One was the budget director, and Alan was the budget director, and Chip was in management. So I called and I just said, "Hey, is there anything coming open in DHS?" And they said, "Well, heck, the deputy budget director is." Wow. So I figured I'd throw my name in the hat and I'd apply and see how I did. So I went through the process and they hired me. So after 18 and a half years with the Air Force, I made the leap of faith and jumped over to DHS. And I can tell you, I very rarely look back. I've done things in my career that I never would have been able to do in the DoD just because of the way they're structured. Right. I was the deputy for a year. I've learned that once I become somebody's deputy, they tend to leave after a year because Alan left after a year and I became the budget director, and then that's when I met you. But I was the budget director for the third largest department in the executive branch. Obviously, DOD is the first, but I would have always been a deputy in DOD because the military is mostly the number one in the services. So that's something that I've learned in my career, that while I bled blue for Air Force, there's a lot of similarities to the way DHS does it. But there's a lot of things that I learned that DOD doesn't do it the best, even though that we think they do from that perspective.
I don't think a lot of people realize, I've been talking to a lot of CFOs from DHS and really trying to build a profile so people have a better understanding outside the Beltway of kind of federal government in general, and then DHS just because it's such a great organization. But the thing I realized is something you just said when Chip Fulgham, he's been on the show. He's had a tremendous influence in DHS, and I would say Air Force in general, like with Alan, yourself, the budget director that took your spot. They definitely that connection. So it works to me. The comparison I would just say is in corporate world. A lot of times, if we are servicing a big Fortune 500 company outside of federal, before I got into federal, you would see a top exec move in. Matter of fact, one of the companies that I built, I was probably working directly for a CFO and COOs of Fortune 500 companies. They would leave to the next company and take their team with them, and then they'd parlay, and that would really kind of grow that out. And I just noticed that significant level of professionalism that comes from Air Force budgeting, the people that were there. It was really interesting. I caught on to. I never met Alan, but I've heard so much about him, how great he was and is. But so I think that was a pretty positive thing. When you were in DHS and you moved in from deputy to the actual budget director, before we get into TSA and your current role as CFO, it definitely seemed like a pretty big team and a lot of manual trying to decipher budgets as they went through. And the one thing that I noticed, and we'll talk about this when we talk about mentoring, is you seem to build a really great team together because there's those crunch periods. I always talk to people about the OMB pass back or when things happen, and your team is just cranking through stuff. And so that had to be a great experience. And did you build most of that team? Did you inherit that? How did that go?
I would say it was probably 75% inherited, and then 25% able to bring in people that new people, but then also getting people in the right position. Not every job in the budget division position, it is the same. I had people who focused more on execution and the more technical. I had some people that were, trying to figure out what we're going to do 2 years from now so we could talk to Congress about it. So it was ensuring everybody was in their right mindset. And then it was also explaining to people, you talked about pass back. Pass back is the 72-hour sprint that we're going to get a product and then we're going to give an answer in 72 hours.
Yep.
And that's combining everything from all the DHS operational and support components, and then getting it clear up to the secretary and speaking not geek speak budget stuff, but talking an operational perspective for the secretary to approve off on it. And it was always, I always felt beneficial to explaining to the team. It is 72 hours. It's going to suck. You're not going to see your kids. You're not going to see your families. But after 72 hours, we get to take a big break because it takes OMB 72 hours to figure out what the heck we're trying to say.
Right.
So we can take a breather then. So it was always kind of setting that expectation that this is what I expect, but then this is what we're going to do afterwards to kind of reset ourselves.
So in that position, obviously, you had a direct line into the office of the CFO, and you were, like I said, I reserved my privilege here. Somewhere in the interview, we're going to talk a lot about the budgeting, but what made you start to get ready as you made the opportunity and the move to CFO at TSA?
It's your fault. I'm serious. No, and I chuckle at that. I had been the DHS budget director for about 2.5 years. Figured I'd do it 3 to 4 years. I mean, it was a trying job. It was a stressful job. My phone would ring constantly, and we'll talk about it later. Yeah. I mean, 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, the secretary had called me before, which is completely fine, but it was just I never could turn off. And I remember having my annual feedback with you and Stacy Marcotte, and you asked me what I wanted to do next, and I said, I have no idea. I'm the budget director for the third largest federal executive department. I said, I don't know what I should do. And you said you'd make a good CFO, and I laughed.
I remember that discussion.
Right, because while I am a mathematician by trade, I'm not an accountant. I don't care about pennies. I normally like to round to millions, hundreds of millions, or billions, if I'm lucky. Audit, while it is very important, it wasn't what kept me up at night or got me excited. It was the budgeting, the programming, kind of the cost analysis. That's what I liked to do. But then it got to the point that I knew it was time to go. I was tired. I still loved what I did. I say the best job I've ever had in my career was the DHS budget director, but I needed something different. And then it's all about timing when you get, to the senior executive service. It's not like there's 100 CFOs in the federal government. And so the deputy CFO at TSA was getting ready to retire. And I said, what the hell? Just because I applied doesn't mean I get the job, and there's probably many people more qualified than I was. So I went through the process, and they picked me. So I started. I left the department in May of 22 after we got the secretary through his budget hearings for fiscal year 23. And I started as the deputy CFO. And as I said with Alan, I became Pat Rose's, and I think you've interviewed Pat before. I became his deputy CFO, and about 3 months later, he told me he was retiring in a year. And then that's when TSA leadership said, would you like to be the CFO? Wow. And I in that kind of year time frame, I did fall in love with being a CFO. The interconnectedness of everything, from defending the budget, but we are spending taxpayers' dollars. Do we know where it is? Are we accountable for it? New financial systems that you had a big part of. So I blame it all on you that I'm a CFO, and 3 years from now, I'm not going to ask where I should go next because I'm afraid of what you'll tell me.
Well, something, Holly, I'm just reflecting on that a little bit. And, it was interesting is I remember the first time I sat through when the president put out their budget in February, March, and then we were meeting with the secretary, and you would take him through the budget. And I think what prompted me to ask you the question is like, you say you have the pocket protector on the inside pocket, but you actually internalize the budget at a very macro level. Like you you talked about it in bigger pieces. You were really good with getting somebody that was not financially into the budget, but it was, and I thought, this was not, and we were constrained. And I don't know if you remember, but we would sit around a table with like 15 or 20 people. And so there was a lot of pressure. Potentially all the component heads could weigh in, and you just kind of controlled the room. And I thought, wow. So, yeah, and I'll stay away from you for the 3-year period. But I was just really impressed. And I wasn't surprised when you ended up becoming the CFO for TSA. Let's talk a little bit about that. So you end up at TSA. Dave Pekowski, who's the administrator, he kind of got held over. He was in the previous administration. He's doing a great job, and a good guy, just a really thorough guy. But it's interesting that it's TSA right now, when you look in what's going on in the news, and you see, big focus on modernization, not so much around finance, but the modernization of the technology of being able to make sure you can do reliable screening, make sure that the screening and some of the things that they're looking at aren't being discriminatory, and so trying to make sure that all the technology is working towards the future, which kind of goes with the themes of AI and some of the things that people are looking at. And then I think just the policy sides of this, you and I talked about, we've talked about this off mic too. It's like many years ago, a lot of people today that are younger don't realize, they used to just be able to walk right up to the gate. And so, so you end up taking on this job at TSA. Talk about the transition in, and kind of, was it something you were kind of familiar with because you've briefed parts of it at the higher level, or it was a lot different when you got there?
Well, I would say, luckily, as you said, I would have to brief on every component, but luckily I could stay at the 30,000-foot view. So I would have the 5-6 talking points. Maybe I could answer a question or two, but after that, luckily I could say, hey, go ask TSA. You got their phone number. You learn the vernacular. But I would say TSA's mission is pretty simple. It is complex in how we execute it, but the mission is simple. It is protecting the nation's transportation systems for freedom of movement of people and commerce. So if you think about that, one thing that, the big thing people think about is aviation screening. We were born after 9/11. We stood up within a year after 9/11 under the Department of Transportation. And within a year, we federalized 435 airports. So that's where you used to walk through, an airport in California. Now you had to get screened by a transportation security officer. So that is what most people think TSA is, and they think that's the only thing TSA is screening to get in, and we call it the sterile area, but to get your checked or your carry-on bag screened so you can go get on your plane. And I would say that's about, funding-wise, pretty close to 95% of our budget. We have about 62,000 employees in TSA, and put it in perspective, about 57,000-ish of those people are transportation security officers, either doing checked bag screening that you see up front, or they're looking at your checked bags before they get on the plane, and then every other thing around that checkpoint that they do. So that's kind of what I knew about TSA. I knew about the aviation piece, but then I didn't realize that the administrator, he also has oversight and compliance for railways, Amtrak, pipelines. People don't think pipeline is a transportation mode, but it is a critical infrastructure. And then once you start thinking, a lot of that stuff is just run off of computers, and what oil is going to what pipeline where. Well, if that can be, there can be a cyber attack on that. The administrator and TSA have oversight of all of that with industry, and those are our big partners from that perspective. So I think going to TSA, it was a mission that I felt strong about. It is a critical mission from that perspective. But then, as I said, while the mission statement is simple, to actually do that is extremely complex and takes not only TSA, but also takes partnership with airlines and, with the airports to ensure everyone is working on the same page, and also working with the Department of Transportation and the FAA.
Yeah, for me, getting involved, I know I'm more of a hands-on type operations and CFO type person. So I wanted to make sure that I was really going out to better understand. And I remember getting a tour of Dulles Airport. And there, like you said, I think you called it the sterile area, but the area where people would see what was going on, where, a lot of the technology is, the bag screening, all this stuff, the people going through, now they'll put your license in and it kind of gets back to you. So it's cutting down the interactions. Right. But I was really interested more of underneath the airport, all of the infrastructure that's really kind of in place to make that airport run, and further security that people don't even realize. Right. And it was almost like the tip of the iceberg is what you see, and then there was so much more underneath it. I also realized that for TSA, the people that worked there, the TSO, the officers that would work at the different stations and the managers, TSMs, really hard job, turnover. A lot of times pay was a challenge with them. And so I think, for me, I knew it was much more helpful to go out and actually see kind of how is an area staffed, what does the profile look like, and my geeky like inside the pocket protector is looking at operational flow, and it was just and then fairly quickly you could do the math to see how something like that would be pretty expensive. And so the office of the CFO, from your perspective, and how it supports the mission, what do you think is the most important part for you as the CFO or you as the organization?
I would say it's twofold. I have to be able to tell TSA's story to defend the budget, because if I try to explain, the dollars and cents of, our $11 billion request to Congress, most people don't care about that. But I need to be able to tell the story of what that $11 billion does for the security of the nation, and how that funding is best used within TSA and not giving it to somebody else. And then I will always joke, some of my staff, how am I affecting the mission of, a canine handler at at an airport, or the TSO looking at checked bags? And I said, well, it's very simple. Without money, nothing is getting done. So if we're not getting the funding from Congress to get our mission done, then something's going to have to fall to the ground. If we're not properly paying our people, and from that perspective, then they're potentially looking at an X-ray machine, nervous that they don't have the money for their family and their children at home, so potentially they're going to miss something that shouldn't be getting into our sterile area, like a gun or something like that. So we need to do our job to keep the stress not on the TSOs or anybody on the front line from that perspective. So I'm a big proponent in we've got to get the funding into TSA from Congress, and then we have to properly account for it to pay our bills and to pay our employees. So the mission then is properly funded, so everyone else can focus on their primary job and not what the CFO is supposed to be doing.
What about the allocation of the budget? Something that you and I would do, and we're kind of fading a little bit back into budgets, but the whole process that we do, the DMAG process to reprioritize the big rocks, make sure that everything was covered, the process that you have to put in place when you have 430 airports, you've got all these different priorities, everything now, like you said, to cyber. What is that a pretty lengthy process that you adjudicated, or is that something done at the deputy level of the administrator office?
So actually, when we craft a budget, so right now, just put it into context, if it wasn't an election year, we would be continuing to work on the fiscal year 26 budget. Yeah. So we're always almost 2 years ahead of what we're spending currently. Because it's a presidential election, it's just delayed a little bit until a new administration gets in. But from a perspective, I am tasked within as the CFO within TSA to lead the programming process. So I get a bucket of money. It's about $11 billion. And what should fit in that bucket that we're going to submit to OMB and then sequentially to Congress later within the year. And then what can't fit in that bucket, and why, and what are the trade space or the risks of funding something over something else. I would say in our budget, over 95% goes to aviation security, just because it's such a people-focused technology process. I mean, every lane at an airport has to be staffed. There's 435 airports, and depending on the size of your airport, you could have one lane up to, 100 lanes. And a lot of them are open. You know, a TSO doesn't have a great schedule. I mean, a lot of airports, TSOs are there at 3 o'clock in the morning because the first flight will leave at 4. And we've got to get folks through screening, and then they're staffed until way late in the evening also. So the preponderance of our funding does go to the aviation piece. But then we also have to have that balance with the other modes of transportation. A lot of that is on the inspection and the compliance side. So one person can do, multiple inspections or compliance, or, we have transportation security representatives in foreign countries. So we have footprints, but they're not huge as you would think on the aviation side. But you bring up cyber. Cyber can never be fully funded, and we can always use more people. So this is always, as we say in budget, I love my president's budget when we submit it to the Hill, but I always have this little, if you want to give me something else, I always have this little, list in my inside pocket that I wasn't allowed to pull it out according to, OMB or you. You always told me I had to like my budget, but I would always, if I could get us a little bit more money, and we kind of do the same thing at TSA, but within TSA, the administrator actually signs off on our programming, but he relies on the deputy, and then he has a deputy action group. So we have our 4 major pillars that TSA, how we're organized. So we have a security operations, and they do, they'll do the operations piece of TSA. So at the airports, within surface compliance, we also have operations support. So they're the folks that figure out what technology is needed next, or the policies and then engagements to support security operations. Then we have enterprise support. So if you think about it, that's your contracting, that's your acquisition program management, your IT, your human capital, training and development, people like that. And then we have our law enforcement pillar, so our federal air marshals. So they're a pillar by themselves. So those deputy executives, so there's a group of about 5 folks, plus our chief of staff. So it's about 6 folks that I will bring in recommendations for the budget. And then we also do a very similar thing for execution to make sure that we're funding, if Congress doesn't give me everything I asked for, which is normally the process, how are we gonna execute a fiscal year with the funding that we receive?
So Holly, a lot of the questions I get, being that I took a tour of duty in there was, hey Troy, CRs, the impacts of that. It's interesting. So the budget, it's October 1st, just about, and so it'll be there would have been a budget starting there. When a budget doesn't happen and they go into a CR, just in general, maybe not even specific to TSA. Explain a little bit about what happens, because there's different stakeholders, right? The general public looks at it and they probably go, with sequestration, they probably go, okay, well, that just means that we slowed spending down, and so we didn't come out hot with any priorities. We really spend to last year's level, et cetera. If you're looking at it from industry, you go, probably no big projects are going to start with from that perspective. And I think, though, if you're looking at it from people like yourself that are on the inside that see the true cost of a continuing resolution. Let's just talk a little bit about that and just see. And you could use TSA as an example, or if that's too sensitive, use the bigger picture.
Well, I would say I have people on my staff who don't know what it is like to have an appropriation on 1 October. As I said at the beginning, I've been doing this a little over 24 years. In the Air Force, I think there were 2 times we had a budget on or about 1 October, and that wasn't anywhere close in the last 15 years. So we learn to execute under a CR. Short-term CR, continuing resolution, let's say it's a month. It's not too terrible. I mean, it always takes you some time to close out the last fiscal year and then to get your accounting system back up. So, but you still got to continue to pay people. But when you start looking at a continuing resolution for a quarter of the fiscal year, for 6 months of the fiscal year, things just get delayed. Now, I do get funding. I get funding at the level I had last year. So we continue to pay people, but we do become inefficient at times. It might be I don't have enough money to fully fund a major 12-month contract. So I have to fund it incrementally. So that means I'm going to do 4 actions instead of just 1. So I have people doing things 4 times instead of just once. You also have to potentially make some trade-offs because I don't know what's coming in the enacted budget. So what I put in my president's budget, I can't hire new people because they might not be funded. So then once I finally get the budget, then I'm running to catch up instead of executing 12 months, kind of at, we call it a straight line. I know what I want to do every month. I have a spend plan, just like we all do in our house. We have a budget for the year. But if I don't know what's coming, then I start trimming and saying, maybe I don't do that yet. Or maybe I just wait. Well, then it's kind of like, when you watch a snake eat, its dinner. Now I see this big thing trying to go through the snake instead of it, kind of going in an even flow. But I think one of the worst things, though, of a continuing resolution is again, we learn to execute. I would say one thing that CFO type people is resilient, and we're going to figure out the job and get it done. One thing that I think is a misnomer from a continuing resolution is under a continuing resolution for TSA, 97% of those 62,000 people will continue to work without getting paid. Wow. So if we remember back in 2019, the federal government shut down for 35 days on the 26th of December. Most of the traveling public probably did not realize that because they went to the airport and flew home from Christmas with their gifts, and the line didn't get longer at our TSA checkpoints. Everything seemed to run smoothly. It's just in my office, and at the time I was the budget director, but like in the CFO office, there would have been 5 people working instead of 135 people working. So I think that is one thing people don't realize is that government will continue to work. It's just very uncertain times because before that shutdown, it was not guaranteed that your pay was retroactive, even if you worked. So I think, and if you look back, I think national parks starting to shut their doors is one main reason. The government opened back up in 2019 because it affected the public. Yeah.
Direct touch.
Right.
Before we move off of TSA, I also get a lot of questions. Talk about the $5 ticket fee. I travel every week.
$5.60.
Yeah. So, but a lot of people don't realize why that was instituted. And I know it's not a big deal, but actually $5 on each person adds up. And it's both ways. So it's like twice that for one ticket. But talk about that funding, where that money goes, and what it's used for. What was the main purpose?
No, definitely. So it's called the Aviation Security Passenger Fee. In short, it's the 9/11 fee. So after 9/11, as I said earlier, TSA was born out of 9/11, and when Congress wrote the Aviation Transportation Security Act, ATSA, that is what gave TSA, stood us up and gave us the authority and kind of our marching orders. It wasn't set up exactly this way. It has changed over the years, but Congress said taxpayers shouldn't have to pay for this new entity to help secure the nation's traveling system. So they created the aviation security fee, the 9/11 fee. So it's $5.60 for every one-way ticket or $11.20 round trip. And so we collect that revenue from all airlines when you book your ticket. It's just a subset. If you click the little question mark under fees, we're listed as one of the fees along with, fuel fee or whatever else is on there. We collect in that revenue. It's about $4.2 billion a year, depending on, obviously depending on, how many people are traveling. But TSA, we screen about 3 million passengers a day across our system. So you can quickly do the math from that perspective. The way Congress set up our fund, so that revenue that we get in, the first $250 million goes into a special fund. It's called the Aviation Security Capital Fund, and that funds the checked bag technology for explosives. So that was one piece that we wanted to get at very quickly, was we didn't want somebody put in an explosive and a checked bag that was going to be underneath the airplane. So that fund gave industry and TSA kind of a guaranteed stream of money. we pretty much figured the capital fund would always get, the fee would always give us $250 million. Then, and then the rest of the funding would come to TSA to offset funding Congress would give us in our appropriation. So not all funding was borne on the taxpayers, because that's what appropriations are funded from. Then in 2014, we had deficit issues. You had brought up sequestration. Yeah. That is the greenest eye shade word that we could all use, but it was another way to cut funding. So Congress could not come to certain pieces and parts of their deal. So they wrote into law, and it changes every fiscal year, but just because it's in the billions of dollars, we'll round. It's the next $1.6 billion that we accept in revenue goes to the Treasury to help offset the deficit. And that will go until fiscal year 27. So that is funding that a traveler thinks is going to offset aviation security that is doing nothing, and but it's paying down the deficit. Wow. So some people would call that a bait and switch for what a taxpayer is paying, but it's all going to the greater good of the Treasury from that perspective. And then the remaining funds, then that comes back to my bottom line, and it just offsets my appropriation. So our big budget, my appropriation is about $11 billion. It's a little more than that, but then we get offset whatever is remaining. So normally, it's around, $2.3 billion that the taxpayers don't have to pay for.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. I had to throw that one in. Before I go and talk a little bit about leadership, I wanted to go backwards a little bit to budgeting. So, when you and I intercepted each other, you take a look at the budgeting process at a headquarters, just in general. And, one of the things that I really learned from you and that organization was, I always say, I've said this, I don't know if you've listened to a couple of the other episodes, but I think the budget director is one of the most powerful positions within a department, because even at the CFO level, the budget director has a relationship with the appropriators. So in Congress, there's the authorizers and the appropriators on both the House and the Senate. So on the House and Senate side in appropriations, the Office of CFO for DHS has that relationship. Right. And it's primarily managed through at that point, you was the budget director, and you would be able to kind of have those interactions with the clerks for each of the folks that kind of possess the offices of what they call the four corners, the ranking and majority member for the House and the Senate for both sides. And then you also had the relationship with OMB. So that a lot of times a lot of people aren't aware, but Office of Management and Budget, OMB, is kind of an extension of the White House. And the OMB director is a cabinet level position to the president. And so that position I always looked at as like the master CFO for all of the government. It also does a lot of the administrative policies and management policies. But so the way the executive branch would manage policy and resourcing of policy was they would have their secretaries out there that would be focused on execution. Then they would have the OMB director pushing to make sure they're consistently funded, and they kind of keep everything in check. The OMB director, there's a structure in there that would then eventually get down to the component levels, and the components would have evaluators that would be kind of assigned to each of those groups. And so I'm kind of piecing this together because I want to talk about each section. And so then that's OMB. And then, we also back at HQ, you had the Office of the CFO. We were trying to deal with kind of two different things. One, what was the secretary's intent? What we were trying to do? And legislative affairs, which is a different part of DHS. They handled the authorizers, but they really had, the main charter for dealing with the Hill. And so a lot of times, especially at DHS, you and I would struggle a little bit, I think. I struggled because, we had one side of, the appropriators, they had the authorizers, and then but we had to stay coordinated. And a lot of times the secretary would go, hey, guys, what's going on? And there might be two different messages. So we needed to make sure we were kind of aligned. Holly, in your role, I thought it was really important because in the same way you helped the secretary understand the budget, you were also very good at kind of maybe topically or maybe deeply maintaining these different relationships, either through you directly or your staff. And I would just like to talk just for a few minutes, and maybe we start with Congress and the appropriators. Talk about the relationship that you had to kind of form being in that office to make it successful. And then I've got a couple questions after that.
No, definitely. I think that is one of the key relationships the budget director or someone has to have. Someone has to have the rose pinned on them to say, you are the one and you are the voice that talks to the four corner clerks, not to the members of Congress. That's for the secretary or the component heads. But those clerks needed someone to call that could get the DHS budget story. And on my staff, the four corner clerks, they would have their own staffs that would call my staff to get a specific, I have a Customs and Border Protection question, I have a TSA question. But if it was something overarching, they were coming to me to get an answer.
When we say four corners, the
appropriators.
Yeah.
So the House and Senate majority and minority appropriation.
Each one is a corner.
Yes, one. Yep. So we call them the four corners. Yep. And then I would joke sometimes one corner would call and didn't want the other three to know what we were talking about.
That's right.
Sometimes you would get two corners, so you would get the Democrats from the House and the Senate or the Republicans. But a lot of times the way appropriators work, it is very, they try to do bipartisan, bicameral. They're trying to get to an enactment that isn't the best for everybody because it's a compromise, but it sufficiently funds the mission for DHS. I would say not having an open and honest relationship would be detrimental from a perspective for DHS. I would always tell my counterparts in the Appropriation Committee, just because you don't like the answer I'm giving you does not change the answer to the question you're asking. I'm answering it from what does DHS need and the impact and the criticality of what would happen if you do something or don't do something. And even to this day, I still have great relationships with them now.
What's interesting is that, here in DC, a lot of times, especially in the time that I've been away, I get involved with Schedule F discussions, these different discussions of like, how do they redo government and how the politicals and the career people. And, a lot of people ask me questions and I, about what is my view on some of the career jobs and some people are really extreme, hey, we need to replace everybody and get them in. It's like anybody that says that has not been in a job where you have to depend on somebody that's very technically qualified, very politically savvy. And I would also say even on the political side, my response to people on the political side is we need better politicals. We need people that can kind of sit back and have managed large things. Like you said, you had a very tough job of being able to tell, me, hey, Troy, this is what we're going to do. I would be very direct, like, hey, we need to do this. And I knew going in, it was reasonable. We were going to try to get the best deal we could. And it wasn't like I'm directing you, like, get a good deal and you didn't get it, so you failed. It was like I felt like we were partners and we'd go through. And the same thing that you said about, and I think this is a really important point for the show, is that I knew that you had very tight relationships with both sides of the aisle in Congress, but I knew that there was like an area of gray that when you'd go away, that stuff happened. But I never questioned your loyalty to the organization. Right. I never, not for one second thought, you weren't trying to get the best deal. But I think, again, that was just the level of professionalism from a career perspective that you had to be able to bring the deal. And I always use that as my standard of, if somebody really was malicious or malevolent as a career person, didn't want to do the execution of whatever the policies of the currently elected are, then I could see an area of being malevolent, where and mistakes at our level where you and I were operating were hundreds of millions of dollars. So if we were like not doing this together, and it wasn't you and I winning or losing. The department didn't win. The taxpayers didn't win. The people that voted for whatever the administration was didn't win. And I think we took that super seriously. But I think a lot of people that I saw around me in government in different departments didn't always have that level of maturity to be able to realize this is how you have to do it. And maybe it was my 12 years of being in a city council of realizing like things aren't, they always call it sausage making. You know, it's just not pretty.
Right.
But sometimes people that are not experienced and they come into government and they say, hey, go do this. And they're like, well, they're not doing what I told them to do. And it's like, no, you got to work through this.
Right.
And so from your perspective, though, I guess giving me feedback, you've seen a lot of people kind of working through those types of positions. And any tips that you would give people that want to go into political life, but are realizing they got to encounter, career people, and that, we're all kind of, I think, most of the people that I've come in contact were really trying to go after the same objective.
Right. I think advice that I would give, and even from an apolitical perspective, I don't care, whatever administration is in there, that is what your senior executive corps is supposed to do. We're supposed to keep the day-to-day life of the department, of the executive branch running, and even when priorities change. To give you an example, I was obviously the budget director between, President Trump and President Biden's transition. Obviously, President Trump was very big, and he wanted to spend a decent amount of money on the border wall. And we pushed very hard until about 11:50 on Inauguration Day. And then after that, priorities changed. And I said, okay, we're no longer, running down this path. We're going to change the path. And so from a career perspective, I try to say it very simplistically. It's a game. I'm playing 3D chess when it comes to the budget and all the players that are there. From a political perspective, not to demean the politicals, they're still learning how to play checkers from how the budget process, because the budget process in government is very, very complex. So I do not expect any political that sits down in a chair during a transition to realize that there's, to realize what the process is to create a budget, to defend it to OMB, to defend it to the Hill, and then actually to execute it. But what I would recommend to a political coming in is you have staff that is their job to run that process and to play that game to the best of their ability once you give them your priorities and where you want to go as an administration. And then know, because that's what I raised my right hand to do, I'm going to go do that to the best of my ability. So I've just kind of noticed through several different transitions at different levels, the lack of, oh my gosh, it's a blank piece of paper and I have to fill it up. No, the paper's pretty full. I just need you to edit, and then we can move it forward.
Right.
Does that make sense?
That's really good advice too. Because I think, when you do come in as a political, you really want to do a good job. And, I think what's a little bit different from me is I was a corporate guy. I come in from the Fortune 500. But I think, too, is you looked at stuff that was going on there. I think you and I, we started looking at stuff, too, like fees. And we started realizing during COVID when everything started shutting down in USCIS and we started really losing the fees and they were spending kind of their savings account spending down. And, we together, I think you and I went through and we created kind of a fee scorecard for all of DHS. And pretty soon we started giving that to Congress and saying, hey, look, because a lot of people didn't realize the mechanics of that and how to plan it. So I thought it was very good. I would just say I think it was open for suggestions. Some of them crazy, and some of them were, plausible. But I think that was the beauty too of getting some different ideas in. Right.
And I would say with the fees, because in TSA, not only the 9/11 fee that we have that offsets our appropriation, we have 12 other vetting fees. TSA pre-check is the biggest one. So that is revenue. So you pay for example, pre-check $78 for 5 years, and then we vet you, do a security check, talk through the process, so then you can go through, the pre-check line, don't take your shoes off, or have to take your laptop out. But nobody really thought that revenue would, not come. Every year I get about $500 million in my 12 vetting fees, very similar with USCIS. Well, we realized during the pandemic, CBP has huge fees for agriculture. Well, when stuff's not flying and stuff's not coming in, there's no fees. So there's no revenue coming in. And I think that I remember the first time you said, we need this fee scorecard. And I'm like, why? Fees are always there. And then when you realize oh no, we could have seen this coming and we wouldn't have had to jump through as many hoops. And again, like you said, to this day, as a component, I still get it every month and we still talk to Congress about it. And sometimes you have too much in those fees, but I think having that different view of how to look at our records, because there's a lot of times, like I said, well, those fees are always going to be there. People are always going to pay. But we never had a pandemic like we had before like this. And I think if and when it would happen again, there are so many lessons learned that we have and that Congress has that we know how to react quicker and not have as many, hair on fire moments from that perspective.
So Holly, now that you're at TSA and we kind of look at the bigger picture of leadership and some of the different stuff that you've been going through, the ability to network and to be able to connect with other CFOs. I always said this about Stacy. She was really good at getting all the CFOs together for all the components, and there'd be a lot of synergy where everybody's kind of comparing what's going on, and there's an alignment. But I was just curious from your view, now that you're a CFO at a component, any other types of activities that you do to network or to build your maybe it's eminence in the area, to make sure that people are understanding that the taxpayer money is in good case, everything like you've just talked about, or just even career-wise, or trying to get exposed to stuff that you would see from now being a CFO at a component?
So I would say having that relationship with my other CFOs just to kind of make sure we're all on the same page. I mean, DHS, as I said at the beginning, we're a little schizophrenic just because of to protect the homeland. There's a lot of different facets to protect the homeland, but underlying, we all do the same thing. We all have a mission. We all have to get the resources to do that mission. So it's kind of, if I can call, the FEMA, CFO, I will never have a natural disaster that I have to pay for, and I don't have grants funding that she does. But it's also, hey, I'm having this issue with my accounting system, or it's, hey, we're thinking about this, and where are you guys going? Because you guys went first. So just being able to have that sounding board, it's going to be different, but then I can figure out how to translate that into what TSA would need. But I would say one of the biggest relationships that I felt critical to keep was with the Four Corners, and also with the Office of Management and Budget, just to make sure I can tell TSA's story. Because there's only one person in the department that can tell TSA's budget story better than I can, and that would be my administrator. But I would say from a perspective, like I said, when I was the budget director, I got my 5 talking points for every component. But if you really want to know what TSA does and what we need and why we need it, I'm the one that I want OMB or the department or the Four Corners to call. But for me to be able to do that, the biggest relationship that I have to cultivate is with my assistant administrators within TSA. So my counterparts that are, doing the aviation screening mission, who have the canine handlers, who have the inspectors, our law enforcement, our federal air marshals, to understand their missions and why they need funding. Because if I can't take them to every meeting I go to. When I was the budget director, when the Four Corners were, in the throes of doing conference, fun story. I remember he was the Senate Majority Clerk. He called me and said, Holly, Senator Capito said, we're not going to bed tonight. We're going to have a deal by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Please don't turn your phone off.
Wow.
So I told Heather, I said, phone's not going off, but I promise I'll be quiet. And I remember 3 o'clock in the morning, and for a couple days in a row, my phone would ring. The clerk would say, Holly, you need to put your contacts in. We need you to work for a little while. Those were nights I definitely was not calling you or the secretary to ask you what your opinion was, but I knew where I was allowed to go. But it was those relationships, but it was then the relationships I had built with my counterparts out in the components that I knew the answers, and I felt confident to say, yeah, you have $100 million. Here's where it should go, and here's why it should go there, and here's why these are not as great ideas. So for me at TSA, it is talking with my counterparts to make sure I understand their frustrations, their concerns, so then I can, when no one else is around and I'm the only one that can talk it, I can do justice for that.
So Holly, maybe one of the last questions I had for you was on mentoring. bring up, there's a couple people that I work with that worked for you that were pretty incredible. And I was just kind of curious as you kind of going through, now you're a CFO at TSA. Do you have a process? Are there ways that you invest into trying to mentor people now to kind of maybe help them follow a path very similar to where you're at?
Outside of, taking care of the people in the CFO for TSA, I think it is one of my main jobs as a senior executive is to help people get to where they want to go. Mm-hmm. I am not sitting in this seat as the CFO today because of things I did by myself. I had great mentors throughout my career, and they are now friends. From that perspective now, who I could sit down with and have an honest conversation of where I wanted to go and when I wanted to do it. And then they'd have an honest conversation back to help me get to where I want to go. Some of the conversations did not go the way I wanted them to, but looking back on it now, I can see why. So one thing I told myself, I became a senior executive in October of 2018. I told myself then I was not going to pull the ladder up behind me and not help others get to where I have been. So I make it a point, if somebody wants to talk to me about mentorship or about career progression, they are allowed on my calendar for as long as they need to be. Might not be exactly when they want it to be, but I make it a point that if they want to ask for my opinion and my advice, I will give it to them. Only rule I make is I'll never make a decision for them, but I can give them, options because I can see a larger landscape or more of the horizon, and I can tell them my story on how I got there. But I make it a point to try to help people get to where they want to go and offer them places on how to get there. And that's CFO type people and that's non-CFO type people also. So I think that is critical in getting folks in the right jobs at the right time to try to figure out, I want to be the CFO at TSA for a little while longer until you tell me what the next thing I should be doing is. But how do I find my replacement? Because if I'm not talking with people and showing them what they need to do and how they need to do it to get there or the boxes they need to be checking, then I think I have failed because this isn't about me. I would say, being a federal civil servant isn't about me. It's about service. And it's service at the federal level, it's a service to our nation. And how do I continue to properly spend taxpayers' dollars for the Department of Homeland Security to protect the homeland, and trying to push that and instill that into our younger generation as they try to, can come through the ranks to sit in our seats when it's time for us to go.
Yeah. Well, Holly, this has been awesome. It's been so
Thank
nice
you.
catching up to you.
Yeah.
It's funny. It's like we were joking a little bit during the pandemic. We got to see each other's home a little bit because sometimes we had to be doing stuff on Zoom. And so I finally got to meet Heather.
Yes.
And after hearing so much about her, so it was a real honor and a privilege. And I'm super excited for you. I really am.
No, thank you. And I thank you for letting me sit and chat about my career. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, and I still think to this day I'm just the CFO of TSA. It's really no big deal, and who would want to listen to me talk? But I at least know Heather's gonna, click on the podcast when it comes out. But no, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Holly. You have a good one.
You too.
Thanks again for joining me today on the Ameritocracy Show. Be sure to follow me on social media and our website at troyedgar.com, where you can get more information and sign up for my weekly email. I hope you have a great week.